Good evening and good morning for those joining from Korea and Asia. I'm Sheen. I'm Director of Korea Program here at Seoul and Asia Pacific Research Center. So I'd like to welcome all of you to this special seminar on two Koreas and China. So when we are planning this seminar, I was really hoping that we can do in person, but looks like we'll have to wait a little bit longer, even though things are getting much better here in California. So hopefully we can see you all in person in the spring quarter. So before I introduce today's panel, let me make one announcement that our final seminar this quarter is on March 10 to analyze the Korean presidential elections with the two speakers joining from Korea. So today I'm very happy to have this seminar addressing very important and timely issues. As you know, this year, South Korea and China mark their 30th diplomatic anniversary, and their relationship has really evolved into a strong partnership. For example, China has become South Korea's top trading partner, and Chinese are the largest international students in Korea, and also Koreans are the largest international students in China. However, their mutual attraction appears visibly moderated in recent years. Actually, last month, our team has conducted a survey in Korea, and it shows that Korean view of China is more negative than Korean view of Japan. It's a really striking trend. In addition, it looks like anti-China sentiment will affect Korean elections. Our survey also shows that about 78% saying that Korea-China relations is an important factor in deciding which candidate to vote for. So is it really temporary setback in the bilateral relationship? And also, how should a new president deal with Korea's China policy when he or she comes into power in May? Let's look at North Korea-China relations. And as you know, in recent years, China and North Korea became closer. There were multiple summits between Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping, but the pandemic constrained trade between the two countries. So here we wonder whether rise of anti-China sentiment in South Korea would affect North Korea-China relations. And what is the current state of the bilateral relationship between Pyongyang and Beijing? And what choices will Kim Jong-un make under strategic competition between Washington and Beijing? So today our panel will examine the factors that will shape and influence the future prospects of Seoul-Beijing ties and the relations between Pyongyang and Beijing, both of which have important policy implications for the United States. So now we have two excellent speakers for today's panel. First, Dr. Seong-hyon Lee was a senior fellow at the George W. Bush Foundation for U.S. China Relations, and also currently visiting scholar at the Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard University. And actually, before coming to the United States, Dr. Lee lived in China for a decade, and then joined Sejong Institute as the director of U.S China Center. And actually, he spent 1 year with us at the center many years ago. So it's very good to have you back to our event, Dr. Lee. And then the second speaker, Dr. Sheen or Woo Shin, he was a special policy advisor to the South Korean ambassador in China. Actually, I met him when he was working for ambassador, and I had a dinner with ambassador and also him in Beijing. And he's spending this year as a visiting scholar at our center, and he's working on the development and changes of China's aid to North Korea. And both are fluent in Chinese, and actually both of them went to Tsinghua University in Beijing for doctoral degree. All right, so as usual, each will make remarks for about 15 minutes, and then I'll have a conversation with both of them, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. So please send your question to Q&A box. All right, so without further ado, let me talk to Dr. Seong-hyon Lee to talk about China-South Korea relations, followed by Dr. Woo on North Korea-China relations. Okay, Seong-hyon?
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Sheen, for having me. I don't plan this presentation as a comprehensive examination because of time constraint. I just point out a few highlights of what's going on between Seoul and Beijing relations, and especially the anti-China sentiment and some interpretations. I would say that this time, the anti-Chinese sentiment in South Korea is real. Unmistakably, the lowest period that we are in, that our bilateral relations. 10 years ago, for example, we had a way of downplaying Seoul-Beijing relations. For example, oh, it's on the internet. It's just views expressed by a few segments of the society. But 10 years later, today, everyone uses the internet, and the internet views are time and time again correspond to the surveys conducted by in Seoul and also in China. Also, the latest survey conducted by Dr. Sheen as well. And the Olympic episode, we all noticed, and many people were surprised. Why did the Olympic episode or kimchi or Korean traditional hanbok dress prompt such a big reaction in South Korea? Even triggered responses from both two front-runner presidential candidates who criticized China. And I would say that it's not about hanbok dress. It's not about kimchi. It's about identity. It's about who you are as a human being, as a citizen, as a sovereign nation. And Korean people feel that their identity is at stake. Koreans are increasingly feeling that their distinctive identity is being undermined by China. When Xi Jinping in 2017 told Trump that Korea was part of China, it was a bombshell in South Korea. And they fear that as China becomes stronger and powerful, Koreans sense that there is an increasing trend in China in recent years to expand its sinicization of its neighboring countries' culture as part of Chinese culture. So the controversies that we saw at the Olympics are manifestations of this very mistrust that South Koreans have about China for years, that China does not respect Korean national identity, Korea's autonomy as a nation or as a sovereign country. And also, China doesn't share the values, norms of the international society. It was not about the referee's decision at the Beijing Olympics that caused the volcanic eruption of a rays in South Korea. Actually, when you look at volcano under the surface, something has been boiling for many, many years. The larger point is that there is an increasing Korean public's suspicion about China's future intentions. I think this is the fundamental cause of concern and fear and worry that South Korea has about China. And as Dr. Sheen published a paper about South Korea-China relations early this month, and the paper pointed out that Korea was the only country in which young adults had a more unfavorable view about China than those older. The young South Koreans, which I particularly pay attention to, because they will be the future generations who will build the China-Korea relations for the next coming 30 years, because this year is the 30th anniversary of establishing diplomatic relations. These young generation of South Koreans, they grew up in a liberal democracy, and they can see how different the Chinese authoritarian system really is. In a sense that the more they get to know about China, the more they discover how different the two countries are. And many South Korean young people, they have been shocked by Beijing's crackdown on young protesters in Hong Kong. And this is something that I discovered during my research. And even the Lee Jun-seok, the chairman of South Korea's main conservative opposition party, he visited Hong Kong during the protest, and he said that Seoul needs to fight enemies of democracy. I witnessed China's cruelty in Hong Kong. So this is a very statement coming from 36-year-old young generation leader of South Korea's politics. And South Koreans fear that a big, powerful country is right next to South Korea, and our future is at stake. And that's where this fundamental psychological fear is coming from and originates. And I want to also point out the interesting role played by South Korea's President Moon Jae-in. Many South Korean citizens complain that the Moon Jae-in government is too soft on Beijing. And during my survey, I discovered some converging segment. The segment goes like this. My country's president is not standing up to China's bullying behavior. So I should do something. I should come out and stand up to China. I should say something about China's inappropriate behavior, about appropriation of our culture. So this is a psychological factor that I found very interesting. And this is particularly strong among South Korean young adults, and they are increasingly unwilling to compromise their principles of democracy, sovereignty, rule of law, and freedom of speech for the sake of commercial advantages that South Korea could expect with China. So this is another interesting aspect. In the past, South Koreans and South Korean governments, even though we had some bilateral issues, but then the strong economic, complementary nature, cooperation brought back our relationship back to normal. But this time we are seeing something entirely different, a new phenomena that South Koreans are willing to sacrifice their economic interest in dealing with, principally dealing with China. And finally, I see the current way of South Korea looking at China as the way that Korea used to look at the Qing dynasty. Those people who study the history immediately know what I mean by that. South Korea used to call the Ming Dynasty, the predecessor of Qing dynasty, as a country of soft power. And at that time, the Korea called itself voluntarily we are little China, and we are learning from the cultural prowess of China. But then when Ming Dynasty became Qing Dynasty, and South Korean aristocrats, they begin to refuse to recognize the legitimacy of Qing Dynasty as Zhonghua. That is another way of calling China. China as a cultural artifact of supremacy, symbolizing cultural superiority. So they don't call, refuse to call Qing Dynasty as Zhonghua, China, because according to a Korean scholar at the time, I refuse to call Qing Dynasty as China, Zhonghua, because Qing Dynasty is merely a big country that brought Korea to its knees by brute force. So, a country that is without soft power cannot be called Zhonghua, the real China. So Koreans are refusing to call, identified as Little China at this time, and whether the future generations of South Korean young adults change their mind and call the current China in the 21st century as Zhonghua, the magnificent, culturally supreme country that South Korea look up to, just like they did during the Ming Dynasty, is left in question. And I think that South Korea, which shares the common Confucian culture, Asian tradition, similar Chinese characteristics, commonality of history, if China's soft power fails in its immediate neighbor in Korea, I think that will be a bellwether of whether China's soft power will succeed in other parts of the world in the 21st century. So I'll stop here.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Lee, for your very stimulating remarks, and I'm sure we have a lot to discuss. And once again, for the audience, please submit your question to Q&A box. So now let me turn to Dr. Wu to talk about China-DPRK relations.
Oh yeah, thank you for having me. Yes, thank you for having me again. I'm going to share my point of view about the relations between North Korea and China. I'd like to analyze the relationship with a new research method. It's an attempt to interpret the interaction of environment, institution, actor from the historical institutionalism point of view. To understand this interaction, time must be considered as an important variable. In other words, environment, institution, actor interacts dialectically over time. It means history. I have 4 questions to explain the relations. Let's find the answers through these questions. First one is, what does history tell us about China's relations with North Korea? From Ming Dynasty, as Dr. Lee mentioned before, China has long regarded Korea as a model tributary. This psychological suzerain tributary relationship of Chinese leaders has continued to this day. As Dr. Lee said before, when President Xi Jinping visited the United States in 2017 and met with President Trump, Trump weirdly said that Korea was part of China. Korean people shocked, and those who understand Korean history will not agree that. Prior to the founding of China in 1949, the relationship between the Chinese Communist Party and socialist independence activists of Korea was so strong, and the Korean War further strengthened it. Treaty of friendship, cooperation, and mutual assistance between the People's Republic of Korea and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. China and Korea was signed in 1961, but in reality, the previous relationship was closer to the term blood alliance. However, as China saved North Korea in the Korean War, China wanted to interfere with the North Korea's internal affairs as a savior. This interference policy reached its peak with the August 1956 plenum incident, and Kim Il-sung since became extremely wary of China and pro-China groups. Another famous rationale is teeth-to-lips relationship. This became more a diplomatic rhetoric. History tells us that China-North Korean relations are not usual asymmetric dynamics between a great power and a smaller nation. We should note that the other side of it, the teeth may often bite the lips. North Korea's inherent concern and anxiety is that it cannot trust its neighbor. From the institutional point of view, however, North Korea will not necessarily destroy this treaty that includes China's automatic intervention clause in case of emergency for its own security. After all, the U.S.-China detente, China's reform and opening policy, the end of the Cold War due to the collapse of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, the South Korea's establishment of diplomatic relations with Russia and China made two countries' threat disappear. North Korea woke up from the same bed, different dreams. In addition, China's participation in UN sanctions on North Korea's missiles and nuclear tests has eliminated the binding force of North Korea-China treaty. Only the uncertain treaty remained superficial in the alliance between the two countries. Second question. Some people point to Pyongyang's high degree on dependence on Beijing. China absolutely is the largest trading partner and a major source of food and energy aid to North Korea. It looks like North Korea would collapse without China, but theoretically debates on economic sanctions and interdependence show that there is little reason to believe that economic dependence is easily converted to a big power's leverage over a small state's domestic and foreign policies. China wants North Korea to remain stable. Actually, China's policy toward the Korean Peninsula has always been maintaining the status quo. Instability in North Korea would undermine China's strategic and economic interests. Fear of instability inside and outside North Korea has made China reluctant to exercise leverage over Pyongyang. Pyongyang knows that it can get away with its misbehaviors even though they have infuriated Beijing. North Korea is well aware of how to take advantage of its strategic importance, and the combination of monolithic leadership system, the Juche ideology, and military-first politics has created unique political dynamics within North Korea and that are impervious to foreign pressures. Historically, it has been very difficult to restrict an actor like North Korea within institution unless the actor grants authority. China has delivered warnings against nuclear and missile tests whenever North Korea displayed signs of launching. Multiple tests for the past decades have been a slap in China's face. After each provocation, China has conveyed its opposition and dissatisfaction by voting in favor of the United Nations Security Council resolutions condemning and penalizing North Korea. However, China appears to have resigned itself to living with a nuclear North Korea for the time being. China has been reluctant to impose and implement potentially clipping economic restrictions on North Korea. And we all remember that former Chinese ambassador Cui Tiankai criticized the Obama administration for pushing Beijing to lean on North Korea's regime to change its behavior. It was in 2014. He admitted that it was a mission impossible. Although North Korea's reliance on China is substantial, China cannot be North Korea's boss. Third question. When many people think of North Korea-China relations, there is peculiarity that the relationship between socialist parties is neglected. In other words, we have to remember that the Chinese Communist Party and Workers' Party of Korea are brother parties formed before interstate relations. Therefore, not only interstate communication of diplomacy, but also the inter-parties relations are forming an important institution between the two countries. Besides socialist party relations, two countries have continued their ties through various institutions, but the meaning has almost faded due to the changes of the international and domestic political environment, their own identity and leadership. China and North Korea have been short of being trusted allies bound in blood and belief. From the outset, China and North Korea were uncertain allies who offered only limited cooperation to each other. Mutual strategic needs of the two countries are the only ingredients of ties. In one sentence, North Korea has shown little trust after the Korean War, and China cannot exert influence because North Korea does not keep its promise. However, North Korea is nominal, but the only formal alliance to China. So unlike other countries, China still has the special right to communicate with North Korea through socialist parties. Therefore, North Korea is an unreliable alliance with limited privilege to China. North Korea pursues independence through the approval of the United States, the only diplomatic target country. China is currently the only guardian, but deep-rooted distrust exists between them. So China can be used only when necessary and neglected at any time. Therefore, to North Korea, China is an optional leverage for self-reliance. However, chauvinistic China, which is expected to strengthen authoritarianism through Xi Jinping's third term, and North Korea, the only communist regime to practice hereditary leadership succession, currently need each other. The last question is, what choices will North Korea and China make in the future? North Korea has confronted the UN sanctions with a clean-catch tactic to fight a showdown with the United States. Some scholars predict the collapse of the Kim Jong-un regime, but the possibility seems low. Currently, North Korea has even completed the hydrogen bomb tests. Further nuclear tests are meaningless for the time being. So Pyongyang's domestic policy will focus on the economy. To this end, they will want to sell this finished nuclear at a high price as a product to the United States, the target customer. North Korea wants to absolutely lower the dependence upon China. Here is room for the United States to strategically dig in. As Dr. Seong-hyon Lee pointed out, Trump attempted to resolve North Korea's nuclear weapons program directly without going through China and achieved his own results. As much as the United States was active in North Korean nuclear issue, China's role and strategic space was reduced in reverse. We remember North Korea has been active in dialogue with the United States before COVID pandemic. This indirectly shows North Korea's distrust of China. Right after the Beijing Olympic Games on Saturday, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un sent a verbal letter to Xi Jinping, condemning diplomatic boycotts by the United States and Western countries and celebrating the success of Games. He also emphasized anti-U.S. socialist solidarity, saying, by strengthening strategic cooperation and unity between two parties and between two countries, let's crush the explicit hostile policies and military threats of the United States and its followers and defend socialism, a common fit. Judging from these contents, North Korea halted the missile tests during the Olympics in consideration of China's face, but it is expected to resume soon, with both the United States and the world's attention focused on Ukraine. It is likely that a new provocation will take place between March 10th, when South Korea's presidential election ends, and April 15th, Kim Il-sung's 110th birthday. Rather than pushing ahead with additional nuclear tests, it is expected to complete the test launch of Hwasong 14, 15, or 17 ICBMs, or launch a satellite rocket, just like Kim Il-sung's 100th birthday in 2012. However, in a situation where it is difficult to obtain cooperation from China and Russia, it seemed impossible for the United States to adopt a new UN Security Council sanctions against North Korea. At least during the first half of this year, relations between North Korea and the United States will deteriorate further, and military tensions on the Korean Peninsula will rise. China still emphasizes that it is an important party to the Korean Peninsula issue, and argues that it can exert influence on the Korean Peninsula, which is due to China's unrest over the improvement of North Korea and the United States relations. Therefore, the United States has an opportunity to use North Korea as leverage to secure leadership in the Indo-Pacific region. If we remember the sudden and dramatic establishment of the diplomatic ties between the United States and the Communist China during the Sino-Soviet conflict, the grand bargain claimed by Vincent Brooks is not a vain fantasy. In addition, this will be an opportunity for the United States to take the lead in the strategic competition between the United States and China. For the United States to discuss China's role in the current situation, it can be seen as acknowledging the lack of leadership and avoiding responsibility. Prior to the closing of North Korean border due to the coronavirus pandemic, the highest level bilateral visits between the two countries was unusually frequent. South Korea and the United States also need to declare the end of war and sign a new peace treaty before paying unnecessary transaction costs. This can be also a direct, effective, and forward-looking solution to North Korean human rights issue. The United States has the sword to cut the weak link in North Korea-China relations. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Wu. So I think we have like a lot of questions. Actually, I have many questions, and we got already a lot of questions from the audience. So actually, let's start with a question by my colleague, Tom Finger, addressed to Dr. Lee, or also Dr. Wu can chime in as well. So basically, the question is like this, and Dr. Lee, you stressed importance of identity politics, right, in defining Korean view of China. And can you a little more clarify what does it mean? Okay, I mean, does it mean that such a view reflects defense of a unique Korean identity, or does it reflect substantial difference between China and Korea in some fundamental values, or basically Koreans' disapproval of PRC actions at home or abroad? So it may be useful to a little more clarify what you mean by identity politics. So let's start with that. Yeah.
I want to say hello to Tom Finger. Hello. Everything I know about China, I learned from Tom when I was at Stanford, so I want to thank him. And Tom's question about the Korean identity. Let me give this example during the Olympic ceremony, probably this example illuminates the Korean ethnic woman dressed in the Korean traditional costume, hanbok. That itself was not a problem at all because China did it during the 2008 Olympics, and Korea did not protest. China did it during the 2009 Winter Olympics. At the time, they also dressed ethnic Korean women, dressed the same thing, and South Korea did not protest. It is accumulated a sense of cultural appropriation by China over the years that finally erupted like a volcano. But then, as I said, under the surface, it has been accumulating for a long time, for boiling up. And Koreans, it would have been much better that when China showed the ethnic Koreans living in China called 조선족, describing them as a Chinese, a Korean Chinese minority living in China, just like Korean Americans living in the United States. But increasingly, there has been trend in China to describe, 조선족 동포 as a, local Korean, local Chinese, or Chinese minority without, the suffix, adoption, without the, addition of the Korean identity, where the roots of hanbok or kimchi originated from Korea. And I don't think Koreans are totally denying the intersection of a cultural overlapping room throughout their thousands of history they lived together. But it is that as China becomes stronger and bigger and powerful, in a sense that they feel that China is in a way pushing Korea out of its own identity, and try to assimilate or try to integrate Korea, just like one of the ethnic minorities in China. That was, I think, a threshold that when the identity between China and Korea become blurred, just like in 2002, when China initiated the so-called Northeast Project to begin to call the old Korean kingdom called Goguryeo as a local ancient kingdom of China, without explaining that it was actually part of the Korean ancient kingdom, because present territory, Goguryeo is where it used to belong to the, the current territory of China. So I think this is a complex issue, and we could continue this discussion later between Tom and me.
Okay, so let me follow up with a question. So 20 years ago, okay, 2002, there was a Winter Olympic in Salt Lake City, and there's some controversy about short track, right? And then Koreans were very angry about that controversy, and then later, killing of 2 schoolgirls by military exercise in Korea, and also that was a year of election, and anti-American sentiments swept Korea and election. So 20 years later, this year, ironically, somewhat similar, but this time anti-Chinese. So I think for outsiders, this is not only intriguing, but also perplexed. What's going on? Is there something with Korean that they are going after big powers? And so, I mean, can you maybe compare those two, 2002 anti-American and anti-China this year. So anything similar or different? What do you make of?
Well, I think South Koreans, I don't know about the United States, but South Korea is the probably only country in the world who is, in a way that they think that they could challenge the Chinese authority in a sense, and call China as a disqualified nation, just like a Qing dynasty, lacking virtues and mandate to govern on an equal footing. But I would say that the comparison 20 years ago, the anti-American sentiment in South Korea was directed towards that particular incident. And the South Koreans still don't have any negative feelings to the American culture, American media, freedom of press, American institutions. They love to go to United States to study and learn from the United States. This time, South Korean young people particularly, they don't want to travel to China. They don't want to study in the United States. They don't recognize or acknowledge the political institutions of the Communist Party as something that they could respect. And this kind of wholesale cultural disillusionment, political disillusionment, institutional disillusionment of what Communist Party represents and symbolizes. I think this is something that I have not seen for the last 20 years in researching China.
Okay, let me turn to Dr. Wu regarding North Korea-China relations. And I'm sure Pyongyang is watching closely what's happening between US and China and what's happening in South Korea. So let's say two things. One is growing tension between China and United States, also the rise of anti-China sentiment in South Korea, as we talked about. Is it good news or bad news for Pyongyang?
Well, in my opinion, the anti-China sentiment in Korea can be another leverage for the North Korean government, because the Pyongyang has always declared that the happiest people in the world, first is Chinese people, second one is the North Korea, the third is Cuba, like that. They always appraise the socialist states. So I think Pyongyang will say that Xi Jinping, the Korean people does not like China, but we love Chinese China and Chinese people, Chinese culture. I think I'm sorry, I cannot explain my things. I'm sorry.
What about Dr. Lee? What do you think? I mean, it's a good news, bad news for Pyongyang? I mean, I'm sure they're watching very closely in Pyongyang, right? What's happening?
Yeah, I think that, do you remember that in September 29th last year, Kim Jong-un made a speech at the North Korean Parliament that he diagnosed the current state of the world affairs as a new Cold War. And many people missed it because it was embedded in his typical anti-American rhetoric of criticism. But I discovered that it's a very, I think there is a very significant statement from the top leader of North Korea's top leader who sees the current state of world affairs as a new Cold War, because North Korea benefited tremendously from Cold War by completely siding with China. And new Cold War is approaching, and many countries are worried about new Cold War. But I think North Korea is the only country probably who is embracing this new Cold War, because by completely siding with China, together with Russia, as we saw in the Ukraine, just like old Cold War bloc, North Korea can solve three problems. One, North Korea can solve its economic problems. China will help North Korea, just like Xi Jinping promised to Kim Jong-un when Xi Jinping visited Pyongyang in 2019. North Korea, second, can solve its security issue by hiding under the wing of China, which is another nuclear power and rival competing with the United States. Third, North Korea can solve ideological dilemma. When North Korea negotiates with the United States, North Korea is always concerned about the hidden agenda of Washington, undermining or regime change. But both North Korea and China, they are ideological twins of socialism or communism, so that there was no hidden agenda of China attempting a regime change of North Korea dictatorship. So these three elements of similar to Cold War, I think North Korea is getting closer and closer and also China is also close to North Korea. Of course, we normally see this as a marriage of convenience, but then the convenience is so great that this time I think that they are entering a new blood alliance period, just like we saw during the Cold War era. So to conclude, I don't think North Korea see this a good thing or bad thing. I just think that North Korea simply doesn't care because of this big scheme of things that they already set the course, and North Korea is going its own way.
Okay, so let me go back to Doctor one more time. You spent several years at the South Korean embassy in Beijing as a special policy advisor to the ambassador. And of course, North Korea has embassy in Beijing as well. So, and then during your days in Beijing, and inter-Korea relations was going pretty well. Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un had summit, and Moon Jae went to Pyongyang and so on. So during those days, I don't know whether you can really answer this question, but then, I mean, have you interact with North Korean diplomats in Beijing? And if so, what are main topics in a conversation? So if you can share any story, as much as you can, that will be very interesting.
Dr. Sheen, speak the truth.
Yes, I talk the truth, only the truth, nothing but the truth. But actually, there is not the public meeting or public dialogue between two ambassadors, but they can see each other on the Chinese government's in the event of Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China, but they just say hello to each other and do not talk about that much. I can say that Ambassador Zhang and Ambassador Luo have met the Ambassador Ji Jae-ryong before. That's all. That's all.
Okay.
Really. Yeah.
Okay. So then let's talk about then what's going to happen now. South Korea will have a new president in May, and already conservative candidate Yoon Sung-yeol, he's saying that South Korea should bring more thought. I mean, that really provoked a strong, anger from China, and then China retaliated economically. That's kind of a turning point between China and South Korea. So, how new president, whoever wins, let's say Lee Jae-myung might become president or Yoon Suk-yeol. What should expect China-South Korea relations, let's say in the next year or two? Should they really be concerned, or their way to improve the bilateral relations? So what would you suggest to new president?
I think that if Yoon Suk-yeol becomes a president, we will see more or less the same tradition of Washington-centered putting U.S. South Korea alliance first, and also try to have a healthy, constructive relations with China, that especially on the commercial ties. But it'll the bolstering of U.S. ROC alliance and putting emphasis on the values of democracy, human rights, and rules-based international law, South China Sea. Also, there will be more robust cooperation in the emerging Quad in terms of the vaccine cooperation or environmental cooperation. So it'll be more of a return to the traditional old days of the Conservative Party. When it comes to the Lee Jae-myung, the left-leaning candidate, if Lee Jae-myung is a true populist, just like what many South Korean media pundits claim he is, that means that we don't necessarily expect a good relations, continuing good relations of Moon Jae-in to the same party of the Lee Jae-myung, because if you remember when this Olympic fiasco happened, it was Lee Jae-myung who criticized the Chinese behavior, and Lee Jae-myung who also said that if there is illegal Chinese fishing boats in the West Sea, will destroy down the Chinese fishing boats. That shocked the public. We thought he was a left-leaning pro-China candidate, just like President Moon Jae-in. But then he said so, very strong words. And a characteristic, defining characteristic of true populist is that you don't do things people don't like. So if South Korean public continues to be hold anti-China sentiment, then Lee Jae-myung will play along with the South Korean public sentiment in his dealings with China to please the public.
Okay, so this is certainly bilateral relations. So it's not only a matter for Korea or South Korea, but also for China. And this also a question from the audience that so how would China react to election of new president? How they re-elect, how they react to President Yoon Suk-yeol or President Lee Jae-myung? I mean, Dr. Wu, do you have any thoughts? What will be their reaction? Yeah, you're muted again.
Actually, to tell the truth, China seems that they don't like both of them. Yeah, to tell the truth, yeah, because just like Dr. Lee said before, President candidate Yoon Suk-yeol from the opposition party, he will deploy the second thought. It is another shock to Chinese people, and the Lee Jae-myung, as also Dr. Lee said before, they will sink all the unlawful fishing ship of the West Sea of Korea. But China will think that if Lee Jae-myung become a president of Korea, it will be the season 2 of Moon Jae-in regime.
Mm-hmm.
Mm. Yeah.
But if I may just piggyback
Sure,
on
yeah.
Dr.'s comments that, actually there was a learning curve of Chinese leadership about South Korean politics, particularly about Moon Jae-in. Moon Jae-in government is supposed to be, is known as a pro-China, probably arguably the most pro-China government in the South Korea's recent history. But from Chinese perspective, China expected Moon to be pro-China, but when you look at Moon's behavior, it was not pro-China enough. For example, the dad was deployed in South Korea, and when Moon became president, Moon let the dad stay in South Korea. So it kind of made South Korea, China scratch its head that Moon was supposed to be behaving like pro-China guy, our guy, but his behavior is not pro-China enough. So there was some sort of mistrust about dealing with the left-wing government in China. That was a learning curve. At the same time, there was a new emerging argument in China that just like in China-U.S. relations, actually the Republicans, that is more the anti-China administration of United States, was easier to deal with from Chinese perspective. For example, the Nixon's visit to China, China wants it doesn't care whether it's a leftist government or rightist government. China cares about is that whether this government, whether it's Seoul or Washington, can we make a deal between us? And they think that the conservative government, even though they are ideologically more anti-China, but when it comes to deal-making process and the outcome of deals, they found that from history in the U.S. China relations that the conservative governments are more faithful in terms of implementing the agreements, so that actually they have a emerging hope that if we could talk with the Yoon Suk-yeol camp at the early stage of administration, if Yoon gets elected, then we should send an envoy and have a real talk of whether deal is possible.
Okay, so maybe one final question to Dr. Woo. So you mentioned that North Korea might provoke, again, maybe sometime between March and mid-April. And do you think North Korea may behave differently depending on who wins the election, either Lee or Yoon? I mean, obviously, on the surface, Lee Jae-myung will be more pro-engagement, and Yoon is likely to take a hardline policy towards North Korea. So, do you think North Korea may react differently?
Oh, I think there will be a different, because Yoon Suk-yeol is very strong to North Korea, and Yoon Suk-yeol is, in my opinion, Yoon Suk-yeol is pro-United States, pro-Japanese.
Alliance, yeah.
Alliance with these two countries, not with China and North Korea. North Korea will be very strong position to Yoon Suk-yeol government, but if Lee Jae-myung become the president of Korea, well, there will be a friction between South and North Korea, but maybe we can expect the dialogue with the North Korea, the United States, and Korea.
Okay. Okay, so I think going back to 2002, when Nomuyan became president, he was seen as kind of anti-American or at least critical of United States. But actually, in my view, U.S. ROK relations became stronger during, especially in later years of his tenure, then after he left office. So I'm hoping that this time again, things between China and South Korea are not going very well. Then hopefully the new president, when they come into power, and they can try to improve the relations with China. So not only parallel between 2002 and 2022, but also the next Korean administration, can strengthen ties with China, because despite all those complaints and all those issues, still China is a very important country, not only for North Korea but also for South Korea. So I think our time is up. So I'm gonna close our session, and thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, and also a lot of questions from the audience. I tried to address some of them, but not all of them. And once again, we will have a seminar to analyze Korean election on March 10. I think it's March 10. So hopefully we can see you again. So thanks again for joining us, and have a great evening and great day.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
오늘 죄송합니다.